The air in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont Geneva was worth more than most countries' GDP. Tonight was the Beaumont Legacy Auction, and the prize was a 50-carat, flawless blue diamond, the Azure Tear. Seated in the front row was Stephen Vanderbilt, a titan of industry, with the impossibly beautiful Victoria Lacroix on his arm. They were the picture of power. But they didn't know that 3 rows back, cloaked in the shadows, another figure watched. She wasn't on the guest list. She was 7 months pregnant, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, her heart beating a rhythm of cold, calculated fury. This wasn't just an auction of jewels. It was about to become an auction of a man's entire life. And his wife, Mildred, was holding the paddle. Mildred de Winter Vanderbilt lived a life curated for the pages of luxury magazines. Her marriage to Stephen Vanderbilt, the CEO of Ethelred Corp., was considered a modern-day dynasty. Their Manhattan penthouse, a glass and steel marvel overlooking Central Park, was less a home and more a monument to success. It was a silent, sterile space filled with abstract art that felt as cold and distant as her husband had become. The first crack in the porcelain facade of her life appeared not with a bang, but with a whisper, a scent. It was Fleur de Nuit by a niche Parisian perfumer, a scent too audacious, too cloying for her own understated taste. She first smelled it on one of Stephen's custom-tailored Brioni suits tucked away in the back of his closet. She'd dismissed it. A chance encounter at a board meeting, perhaps. A hug from a European colleague. But then it appeared again, a faint ghost on the leather passenger seat of his Aston Martin DB11. Doubt once planted is a weed that chokes all reason. Mildred, a woman who managed a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation with the precision of a surgeon, began to notice other things. The late-night board meetings that stretched until 3 a.m. The second phone, a sleek burner model she found tucked into his gym bag, which he claimed was for international security protocols. The digital receipts from florists she didn't use for bouquets, sent to an address in Soho. The final damning piece of evidence came not from a private investigator that felt too crass, too cliché for her, but from a moment of carelessness on his part. Stephen had been preparing for his trip to Geneva for the Beaumont Legacy Auction. He was in his study, a grand room of mahogany and leather, speaking in low, intimate tones on his secure phone. Mildred had entered quietly to ask him about the final arrangements for the nursery. The door, usually left ajar, was shut tight. She paused her hand on the cold brass knob when she heard her husband's voice, stripped of its usual commanding baritone and softened into something she hadn't heard in years. "Of course it's for you, my star," he murmured. "The azure tiare. It will look perfect on you. A stone for a goddess." A pause. "No, she isn't coming. She's delicate right now. The pregnancy is taking its toll." The words struck Mildred with the force of a physical blow. Delicate. As if she were a fragile doll to be set aside while he paraded his new toy. The azure tear. She knew of the diamond. It was the centerpiece of the auction, a legendary stone with a storied past expected to fetch upwards of $80 million. A gift, a public anointing of his mistress. That night as Stephen slept, the sound, untroubled sleep of the pathologically arrogant Mildred did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. She sat in the pale blue nursery, surrounded by unassembled cribs and boxes of tiny clothes, and she began to plan. She was not just a wife. She was a de Winter. Her family's lineage was older, and in the circles that truly mattered more respected than Stephen's new money empire. Her father, before he passed, had warned her about Stephen's ambition. "He doesn't just want to win Mildred," he'd said, swirling a vintage cognac. "He wants to conquer. Be careful you don't become a territory." She pulled out the one document her father had insisted upon, the prenuptial agreement. She had always hated it, feeling it was a cynical stain on their love story. Now she read it under the dim light of a lamp, shaped like the moon. Her father's lawyers at Stratton and Bell had been ruthless. She remembered Stephen balking at one clause in particular, calling it draconian. Clause 7b, the infidelity mandate. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. In the event of documented marital infidelity, Mildred was entitled to not just a settlement, but an immediate and controlling stake in Stephen's personal holding company, the very entity that managed his Ethelred Corp stock and all his liquid assets. To activate it, she needed irrefutable proof, preferably of a public nature that would cause significant reputational damage. A private affair was one thing. A public humiliation was the key. He was about to hand her that key on a silver platter in Geneva. Her mind, once clouded with grief, was now diamond sharp. He wanted to buy his mistress a jewel fine, but she would be the one to set the price, and the price would be everything. She booked a commercial flight to Geneva, not the private jet. She checked into a modest, elegant hotel under her maiden name, de Winter. She contacted her family's private banker in Zurich, a discreet man named Mr. Fournier, who had managed the de Winter estate for 30 years. Her instructions were simple, yet they made the old banker pause. "My dear Mildred," he had said, his voice crackling over the encrypted line. "The sums you are speaking of, this is not a whim, I trust." "No, Mr. Fournier," Mildred replied, her voice steady as stone as she watched the city lights from her hotel window. "It is a correction, a market correction." She spent the next 48 hours in quiet preparation. She didn't pack couture gowns. She chose a single impeccably tailored black maternity dress by Alexander McQueen. It was severe, elegant, and somber, the perfect attire for a funeral. And she bought a paddle. Not an official auction paddle, but a symbolic one. She went to an antique shop and found a small numbered wooden paddle from a 19th century estate sale. The number was 30. Unlucky for some. For Stephen, it would be catastrophic. She would not be bidding as Mildred Vanderbilt, the wife. She would be a ghost from his past and the executioner of his future. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the silent, pregnant woman in the shadows was ready to bring the entire glittering facade crashing down. Victoria Lacroix believed in destiny, but she also believed in architecting it. She wasn't born into the world of billionaires and baubles. She had clawed her way into it with manicured nails and a mind as sharp as the facets of a diamond. Growing up in Lyon, the daughter of a university professor and a baker, she had yearned for a life painted in brighter colors than the muted tones of French academia. Art was her entry point. With a degree in art history and an almost supernatural ability to spot emerging talent, she had become one of London's most sought-after art consultants by the age of 28. She met Stephen Vanderbilt at a gallery opening in Mayfair. He was there to acquire a piece for the Ethelred Corp lobby, a brutalist sculpture she found utterly devoid of soul. He was surrounded by sycophants, but his eyes, a piercing shade of Arctic blue, kept flicking over to her. She was holding court with a Russian oligarch explaining the subtle genius of a Gerhard Richter painting. She was animated, passionate, and utterly unintimidated by the wealth around her. Stephen had approached her after his famous charisma washing over her like a physical force. You speak about art as if it's the only thing that matters. He'd said, a smile playing on his lips. In this room tonight, she'd replied, not missing a beat, it is. Their affair began not as a sordid secret, but as a meeting of minds. He was captivated by her fire, her ambition that mirrored his own. She was a refreshing antidote to the placid, predictable elegance of his wife. Mildred in Victoria's mind was a relic. Old money, old manners, a woman content to be an accessory. Victoria saw herself as Stephen's true partner, a co-conspirator in his conquest of the world. Stephen never lied to her. He didn't spin tales of a loveless marriage or a shrewish wife. In his version of the truth, his marriage to Mildred was a merger, a strategic alliance of two powerful families. It was about legacy, about duty, about the child on the way. But it wasn't about love, that he reserved for Victoria. She understands legacy, but you, he told her one night in his private suite at the Ritz, Paris, you understand life. He promised her everything, but he did it with the careful language of a CEO. There were timelines, strategies, exit plans. The divorce had to be handled delicately. The birth of his child was a complicating factor, but one he could manage. Once the baby is born and the succession is clear, my obligations are re-evaluated, he explained. Mildred is practical. She will understand. Victoria believed him. She saw the unborn child not as a romantic bond, but as a business deliverable, the final clause in a contract he had to execute before he could be free. The azure terre was to be the sealing of their future. It wasn't just a gift, it was a statement. Stephen had told her the story of the diamond, how it was once owned by a deposed king who gave it to his commoner wife, elevating her to his equal in the eyes of the world. When you wear this, he'd whispered to her over dinner, at Le Meurice, the lights of the Tuileries garden twinkling below. Everyone will know. They will see you as you are, my queen. The day of the auction. Victoria felt an electric sense of triumph. She chose a gown of crimson silk, a daring, fiery statement against the sea of muted blacks and navies she knew would fill the room. Her hair was swept up in an intricate chignon, her neck and ears deliberately bare, waiting to be adorned by the most coveted jewel in the world. As she and Stephen entered the grand ballroom at the Beaumont, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. They were the ultimate power couple, radiating a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Stephen's hand rested possessively on the small of her back. Every gaze, every whispered comment felt like a confirmation of her victory. She saw Sheikh Al-Fahim, an oil magnate from Dubai, nod in their direction. She saw the steely gaze of Mr. Kenji Tanaka, the Japanese tech billionaire Stephen was trying to court for a new venture. They weren't just seeing a man and his mistress, they were seeing the new face of the Vanderbilt dynasty. She took her seat in the front row, the plush velvet 8th roan. The auction catalogue lay open on her lap, turned to lot 412, the azure terre. The description was poetic, but all she saw were the words that mattered, a stone of unparalleled provenance and importance. She glanced at Stephen, who gave her a subtle, reassuring wink. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he silenced it. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Nothing he said, dismissing it. Just the usual noise. He turned his full attention back to her, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Tonight is about us. About this." He gestured to the catalogue. about our beginning. Victoria Lacroix settled back in her chair, a picture of serene confidence. She was not the other woman. She was the woman who had won. The wife Mildred was a ghost, a logistical problem to be managed hundreds of miles away, in New York, tending to her delicate condition. In this glittering room, surrounded by the world's most powerful people, Victoria was the reality. She was the future. And in a few short hours, she would have the diamond to prove it. She had no idea that the past had booked a flight, and it was sitting just 3 rows behind her, waiting for the perfect moment to collect its debt. The grand ballroom of the Beaumont was a symphony of discreet opulence. Towering neoclassical columns framed walls draped in silk damask, and immense crystal chandeliers dripping with light cast a warm golden glow over the assembled elite. The air itself felt heavy with the scent of money, a mixture of expensive perfume, fine leather, and the collective, palpable anticipation of financial bloodsport. The guests were a curated collection of global power. There was the aforementioned Sheikh Al-Fahim, flanked by a quiet entourage, his eyes scanning the room with an unnerving stillness. There was the formidable matriarch of the Greek shipping dynasty, Athena Petrikis, her face a mask of aristocratic boredom that hid a razor-sharp mind for investment. And most importantly for Stephen Vanderbilt, there was Mr. Chen. Li Wei Chen was a man of immense and quiet influence. A private equity magnate from Shanghai, he represented a consortium of investors that Stephen desperately needed for his ambitious expansion into the Asian technology market. The deal worth billions was on a knife's edge. Mr. Chen was old school. He valued stability, honor, and reputation above all else. Tonight was not just a social event for Stephen. It was a crucial performance. He needed to project an aura of unassailable control and success. Bringing Victoria was a calculated risk, a power move to show he was a man who took what he wanted. He believed it projected strength. The auctioneer, a distinguished Englishman named Alistair Finch, took the stage. His voice was a finely tuned instrument, calm and authoritative. He moved through the opening lots with practiced ease, a Patek Philippe watch once owned by a Rothschild, a set of Fabergé eggs, a forgotten Degas sketch. Bids were exchanged with subtle flicks of a pen or a barely perceptible nod. It was a silent, deadly game played by people for whom $1 million was a rounding error. Mildred watched from her seat in the 3rd row, partially obscured by a marble pillar. Her presence had gone largely unnoticed. In her simple black dress, devoid of jewelry, she looked like an assistant, a minor functionary. The anonymity was her shield. She kept her gaze fixed not on the stage, but on the back of her husband's head. She watched the way his hand rested on Victoria's bare shoulder. She saw the proprietary smile he gave her. Each gesture was another drop of fuel on the cold fire burning in her chest. Her heart was pounding a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands resting on her swollen abdomen were perfectly still. The baby kicked a sudden sharp reminder of what was truly at stake. This wasn't just for her. It was for this child, for the legacy he was trying to discard. She would not let her child be born into a scandal, a footnote in the story of his father's tawdry affair. She would rewrite the entire book. Finally, Alistair Finch arrived at the main event. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice dropping an octave for dramatic effect, "the moment we have all been waiting for, lot 412. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a single brilliant spotlight hit a velvet pedestal at the center of the stage. A security guard placed a simple black box upon it. Finch, wearing white gloves, opened the box with theatrical slowness. A collective gasp went through the room. The azure terre was magnificent. It wasn't just a stone. It was a piece of captured ski, a concentration of pure electric blue light. It seemed to pulse with its own energy, absorbing the light of the room and refracting it into 1,000 tiny dancing stars. 50 carats of flawless, historic perfection. The azure terre, Finch said, his voice filled with reverence. A stone without peer or parallel. We will open the bidding for this magnificent piece of history at $50 million. A hush of anticipation fell. This was the territory of giants. Stephen turned to Victoria and whispered something, a confident smile on his face. He then gave a crisp, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer. "I have $50 million from Mr. Vanderbilt," Finch announced, his voice ringing through the silent room. Victoria preened a small, triumphant smile, gracing her lips. It was happening. The first shot had been fired, a clear declaration of intent. Other potential bidders, seeing Stephen's aggressive opening, hesitated. Challenging a man like Vanderbilt wasn't just a financial decision. It was a political one. Sheikh Al-Fahim raised a finger. 52, Finch acknowledged. Stephen, without a moment's pause, gestured again. 55 million from Mr. Vanderbilt. His bidding was rapid, designed to intimidate, to shut down the competition before it even began. The sheikh, with a slight shrug, bowed out. The room was now Stephen's. He was performing for Mr. Chen, for the world. "Look at me," his posture screamed. "I am untouchable. I can buy history for my mistress on a whim." Finch began his cadence. $55 million, a breathtaking bid. Fair warning, then. Selling at 55 million. He raised his gavel. And from the shadows of the third row, a woman's voice, clear and cold as a winter morning, cut through the silence. 60 million. The voice hung in the air, a note of discord in a perfectly composed symphony. Every head in the grand ballroom swiveled a synchronized wave of astonishment, searching for the source. Alistair Finch peered out from the brightly lit stage, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry I didn't see the bidder. Please identify yourself." Slowly, deliberately, Mildred de Winter Vanderbilt rose from her seat. The movement was unhurried, graceful, imbued with a gravity that drew every eye. As she stepped out from behind the pillar and into the aisle, the ambient light caught her face. A series of soft, shocked gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't some unknown challenger. It was Mildred Vanderbilt, Stephen's wife, the very woman he had described as delicate and unwell. But she did not look delicate. She looked formidable. Her pregnancy was not a sign of weakness, but a symbol of her purpose, making her silhouette a statement of maternal power. Her eyes, fixed on the stage, bypassed the auctioneer entirely and landed directly on her husband. Stephen froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. She was supposed to be in New York. Beside him, Victoria's reaction was a rapid-fire sequence of emotions. First confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a surge of defiant fury. Her perfect moment, her public coronation, was being hijacked. Her face hardened, her crimson dress suddenly looking garish and desperate next to Mildred's funereal elegance. "The bid is $60 million, Mildred repeated, her voice perfectly level, carrying across the stunned silence of the room. She held up the antique paddle number 13. Alistair Finch, a man who had seen everything, was momentarily speechless. He glanced from Mildred to Stephen, a dawning understanding in his eyes. This was no ordinary auction. This was a duel. Composing himself with professional aplomb, he said, "The bid is $60 million. Do I hear 62? He looked directly at Stephen. The entire room was watching Stephen Vanderbilt. His public performance of power had just been publicly challenged by the one person who could expose it as a sham. Mr. Chen, in the row behind, leaned forward slightly, his impassive face now showing a flicker of intense interest. This was a test of character, far more revealing than any business negotiation. Stephen's shock curdled into rage. How dare she? How dare she humiliate him like this in front of everyone, in front of Mr. Chen? He would not be beaten. He would crush this pathetic rebellion. He turned his body slightly, creating a physical barrier between himself and Mildred, and gave a sharp, angry nod to the auctioneer. 65 million! He barked, his voice raw with fury. Victoria placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity. But her eyes, when they met Mildred's across the room, were filled with venom. It was a declaration of war. Mildred didn't flinch. She simply waited for Stephen's bid to be acknowledged, and then, with the same chilling calm, she spoke again. 70 million. A low murmur swept through the ballroom. This was an escalation of an order of magnitude no one had expected. They had just jumped $5 million. This wasn't bidding, it was annihilation. The price of the diamond was already entering legendary territory. Stephen was visibly trembling with rage. 72. He snapped the word like a gunshot. 75. Mildred countered instantly without a flicker of hesitation. It was clear to everyone now what was happening. Mildred Vanderbilt was not trying to acquire a jewel. She was systematically, publicly, and devastatingly dismantling her husband. Each bid was a blow, a strike against his pride, his reputation, his control. She was using his own grand gesture of infidelity as the weapon of her revenge. Victoria leaned in and whispered frantically to Stephen. "Stop it, Stephen. You're making a scene. Let her have it. It's just a rock." But it was no longer about the rock. It was about dominance. Stephen shook his head, his eyes wild. "She will not win," he hissed. "She will not humiliate me." He raised his hand again. 80 million! He roared, getting to his feet. He was standing now, a titan raging against his fate, his composure shattered for all to see. The room was electric. The world's wealthiest individuals were witnessing a domestic dispute played out with tens of millions of dollars. Phones were being discreetly raised, recording the unbelievable scene. This footage would be poison to Stephen's reputation. Alistair Finch, caught in the crossfire, tried to maintain control. "I have $80 million from Mr. Vanderbilt. 80 million. A new record for a blue diamond." He looked at Mildred, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Mom?" Mildred let the silence stretch, letting her husband stand alone in his self-made spotlight of fury. She let the entire world see him for what he was, a man losing control, a king, being dethroned in his own court. Then she raised her paddle one last time. Her voice did not rise. It was quiet, serene, and utterly final. 100 million. 100 million dollars. The words dropped into the grand ballroom like a neutron bomb, wiping out all sound, all movement, all thought. For a full 5 seconds there was absolute ringing silence. Even Alistair Finch, the unflappable auctioneer, blinked his mouth slightly agape, as if he had to reprocess the sound he'd just heard. $100 million was not a bid. It was a verdict. It was a number so absurd, so far beyond the already stratospheric valuation of the diamond, that it transcended the realm of commerce and entered the realm of mythology. It was a price tag, placed not on a stone, but on a betrayal. Stephen Vanderbilt stared at his wife as if she had just sprouted wings and breathed fire. He staggered back a step, physically impacted by the sheer audacity of the number. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a cold, terrifying bewilderment. Where would she get that kind of money? Their assets were joint, but his personal holding company controlled the liquidity. She couldn't possibly have access to that level of capital without his authorization. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. He looked around the room, his panicked gaze searching for an explanation. He saw hundreds of faces staring back at him, but they weren't looking at him with awe or respect anymore. He saw pity. He saw scorn. He saw the cold, appraising stare of Mr. Chen, whose face was now a mask of profound disapproval. In that single glance, Stephen felt the multi-billion-dollar Asian deal evaporate into smoke. Mr. Chen did not invest in chaos. Victoria Lacroix was white as a sheet. The crimson of her dress now seemed to mock her, a garish splash of color in a moment of utter defeat. She had been the prize, the queen to be crowned. Now she was just collateral damage in a war she hadn't even known was being waged. The $100 million bid wasn't for her. It was a testament to the depth of the wound she had helped inflict. She looked at Mildred, and for the first time she saw her not as a frumpy, discarded wife, but as a terrifying force of nature. Alistair Finch finally found his voice. $100 million. He stammered, his professionalism cracking under the strain. The bid is from Paddle 13. He didn't even need to say her name. There was only one person this bid could belong to. He looked at Stephen, his expression asking the question everyone was thinking. Your move. But there was no move to make. Stephen Vanderbilt, the man who prided himself on always having the last word, was silent. To bid $101 million would be to descend from tragedy into farce. He was beaten. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and publicly castrated by his quiet, pregnant wife. He slowly, mechanically sat back down. It was the posture of a surrendering general. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at anyone. He stared blankly at the stage, at the azure tier, twinkling mockingly under the spotlight. The jewel he had intended as a monument to his power had become the tombstone of his reputation. Finch, understanding the duel was over, moved to conclude. $100 million, he said, his voice regaining its authority. Fair warning, then. He paused, scanning the room one last time for any sign of a challenge. There was none. The battle was over. Sold! He declared, his gavel cracking down with a sound that echoed like a death knell through the silent ballroom. To Paddle 13. The room remained silent for a moment longer, and then a sound no one expected. From the back of the room, someone began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause. It was Athena Petrekis, the Greek matriarch, a woman who respected power above all else. She had just witnessed one of the most ruthless power plays in modern history, and she was showing her appreciation. Another person joined in, then another. It wasn't a celebratory applause. It was an applause of shock and awe, an acknowledgement of the sheer brutal brilliance of Mildred's move. Mildred remained standing, her expression unreadable. She did not smile. She did not acknowledge the applause. She simply stood there, a pillar of calm in the storm she had created. The auction staff, looking bewildered, began to move towards her with the paperwork. But she wasn't finished. Winning the diamond was merely the opening salvo. The checkmate was yet to come. With the eyes of the entire room still on her, she turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping past her husband and his mistress, and settled on a man sitting at a small, discreet table near the exit. He was a nondescript man in a grey suit, but he met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He then stood up and began distributing heavy, cream-coloured envelopes to certain key individuals in the room. One was handed to Stephen Vanderbilt, another to Alistair Finch. A third was delivered directly into the hands of Mr. Chen, and a fourth was placed on the table in front of Victoria Lacroix. Stephen tore his open with trembling hands. His face, already pale, turned a ghostly shade of grey as he read the single sheet of paper inside. Victoria. Her curiosity overriding her shock opened hers. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, her expression shifting from confusion to pure, unadulterated horror. What they were reading was the beginning of the end. The $100 million verdict hung in the air, a gravitational force that pulled every molecule of oxygen from the grand ballroom. The scattered, shocked applause for Mildred had died out, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. It was the silence of a battlefield after the final cannon has fired, a silence filled with the smoke of ruin and the anticipation of the final body count. All eyes were on the fractured triangle of husband, wife, and mistress. But Mildred was not finished. This was not merely a victory. It was a formal transfer of power, and it required the serving of papers. With a barely perceptible nod from Mildred, a man who had been sitting unnoticed near the exit rose from his chair. He was of average height and wore a simple, well-tailored grey suit that rendered him almost invisible, a perfect corporate ghost. He moved with a noiseless efficiency that was unnerving his face, a bland mask of professional detachment. In his hand he held 4 thick, cream-coloured envelopes, each embossed with the discreet, formidable crest of Stratton & Bell, Mildred's family law firm in London. The room watched mesmerised as he began his procession. His first stop was the auctioneer's podium. He placed an envelope squarely in front of a stunned Alistair Finch, who looked down at it as if it were a venomous snake. The second was delivered to the front row, placed directly into the trembling hands of Stephen Vanderbilt. The third was carried with solemn purpose to Mr. Chen, who accepted it with a thoughtful, impassive expression. The final envelope was placed on the small table in front of Victoria Lacroix, landing on the plush velvet with a soft, final thud. Stephen tore his open with a savage, desperate motion. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion and denial. Where did she get the money? How could she do this? He expected to see a petition for divorce, a demand for a settlement. But what he saw was far worse. It was dense, impenetrable legalese, a formal notice printed on heavy, watermarked paper. His eyes scanned the page, catching on phrases that made his blood run cold. Pursuant to the terms agreed upon and signed. Irrefutable public evidence. Immediate and non-revocable transfer of controlling interest. And then he saw the heading stark and brutal, and the world fell away beneath him. Notice of execution pursuant to Clause 7b of the Vanderbilt de Winter prenuptial agreement. Clause 7b. He remembered it now. A hazy memory from years ago in a lawyer's office. He had laughed at it, called it draconian, a relic of a bygone era. Her father had insisted on it. Stephen, so sure of his own power, and Mildred's quiet compliance, had signed it away without a second thought, an insignificant concession to secure a dynastic marriage. He never imagined it was anything more than a piece of paper. He never imagined it was a loaded gun. As the full horrifying implication of what he was holding settled upon him, Mildred finally spoke. Her voice, after the deafening silence, was a physical shock. It was not the voice of a scorned wife. It was the calm, measured tone of a CEO delivering a final, unappealable verdict at a hostile takeover. "My husband, Stephen Vanderbilt." She began, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on him like a physical weight. "Believes in grand gestures. He is a man who appreciates the power of a public statement." She let a beat of silence pass. "He intended to purchase the Azure Terre tonight as a grand gesture for his associate, Ms. Lacroix." The word associate was a masterpiece of cruelty, instantly demoting Victoria from queen-in-waiting to a mere subordinate, a footnote in a corporate transaction. Victoria visibly flinched, as if she'd been struck. "I felt," Mildred continued, taking a deliberate step into the aisle, her presence commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room, "that such a gesture deserved an equally grand response." She looked directly at Stephen now, her eyes holding his, refusing to let him look away from the ruin he had authored. "Our prenuptial agreement, a document you signed willingly. Stephen contains a specific provision. Your lawyers objected to it. You dismissed it. But my father insisted. Clause 7b. You may recall it as the infidelity mandate. It states quite simply that in the event of a public act of infidelity that causes significant and demonstrable reputational damage to the De Winter family name, all personal holdings, including the controlling stake in Vanderbilt Global, transfer to my name, immediately, irrevocably, without contest." A collective strangled simp went through the room. This wasn't a divorce settlement. This was an annihilation. She wasn't taking half. She was taking everything. "Tonight," Mildred's voice dropped, becoming even colder, more precise, "you provided the world with irrefutable public proof of your betrayal. You did so in this room, filled with your most important business partners, your investors, and I'm sure more than a few people with cell phones. The reputational damages, I believe we can all agree without question." Stephen's mind was finally catching up the financial impossibility of her bid, making a sudden, sickening kind of sense. The blood drained from his face as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "The bid I made tonight for $100 million was not a reckless gamble," Mildred explained, as if to a slow-witted child. "It was the first executive decision of the company's new principal. The moment Mr. Finch acknowledged your opening bid for Ms. Lacroix, you triggered the clause. The moment you publicly declared your intention to gift that diamond to her, you executed the terms of your own contract. My banker in Zurich, Mr. Fournier, acting on my legal authority as the new majority shareholder of Vanderbilt Global, approved the wire transfer not 10 minutes ago." She let the horror of it land, twisting the knife with a final devastating whisper that still carried to every corner of the room. "Congratulations, Stephen. You paid for your own humiliation." While Stephen sat catatonic, Victoria, in a haze of disbelief, finally opened her envelope. Her document was different. It was a cease and desist letter, followed by a terrifying notice of civil action. Her eyes blurred as they tried to make sense of the words clawback provision, recovery of misappropriated assets, fraudulent conveyance. A list followed detailing every significant gift she had ever received from Stephen, the down payment for her gallery, the lease on the Soho apartment, a specific wire transfer for a 6-figure sum, even a reference to a custom Patek Philippe watch. They were no longer gifts. They were company assets that she, as a party to the CEO's malfeasance, was now liable for. She looked down at the crimson silk of her gown, at the diamond earrings Stephen had given her in Paris, and she felt as though she were wearing stolen evidence. She was not a victor. She was an accomplice, and she was about to be stripped of everything. Having delivered the killing blows, Mildred pivoted. Her entire demeanor shifted from that of an avenging wife to a commanding stateswoman. She turned her attention to Mr. Chen, her expression softening into one of cool professional respect. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice now crisp and clear, devoid of the earlier emotional intensity. "Vanderbilt Global, under its new leadership, deeply regrets the instability and distasteful spectacle you have been forced to witness tonight. I understand this will undoubtedly impact your decision to partner with our firm." She paused, letting him see her acknowledge the damage. "However, I want to assure you that the source of that instability has been permanently removed. The company is now under stable, and I would argue more honorable management. My team will be in touch tomorrow to present a revised proposal, one built on a foundation of transparency and integrity. I hope you will give us the opportunity to prove that our future is stronger than our past." It was a breathtaking display of control and foresight. She had not only decapitated the old regime, but had already begun the work of building the new one, right there on the blood-soaked floor of the ballroom. Mr. Chen, who had watched the entire drama unfold with the stillness of a chess master, slowly stood up. He looked from Mildred's calm, powerful stance to Stephen's crumpled, vacant form. He saw a reckless gambler and a calculated strategist. He saw the past and the future. He gave Mildred a long, thoughtful look, and then he inclined his head in a slight formal bow, a gesture of profound respect and acknowledgement. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the ballroom, his quiet departure a thunderous verdict on the events of the evening. The deal was not dead. It had just changed hands. That was the final breaking blow for Stephen. The loss of Mr. Chen's respect was more devastating than the loss of his money. He slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of a man, the legal notice clutched in his fist, like the last remnant of a life that was now over. Mildred watched him for one last moment, her face a mask of inscrutable calm. There was no triumph, no pity, no hatred. There was only the quiet finality of a task completed. She turned and walked toward the grand exit. As she passed the stage, a flustered auction official hurried to intercept her. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, the diamond," he stammered, gesturing toward the magnificent, glittering prize. "The paperwork, delivery arrangements." Mildred paused and looked at the azure tear twinkling under the spotlight. It was the catalyst, the symbol of her husband's betrayal, and the weapon of her revenge. It was beautiful, historic, and now utterly meaningless to her. "Keep it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The De Winter Vanderbilt Group will cover the full bid. Consider the stone itself a corporate donation. Sell it again at your next auction. The proceeds are to be given to a foundation that supports single mothers and their children." She looked at the official. "My foundation will handle the arrangements." She didn't want the trophy. It was a relic of a life she had just burned to the ground. She had already taken the kingdom. With that, Mildred de Winter, the sole owner and principal of a global empire, turned her back on the wreckage and walked out of the ballroom, her hand resting on the future she had just secured, leaving the gilded ruins of her husband's life to be swept away with the confetti of a party that had so spectacularly and so deservedly ended. The fallout from the Beaumont legacy auction was not a quiet ripple. It was a global tsunami. Before Mildred's flight had even touched down in New York, the story had gone supernova. Grainy cell phone videos of the confrontation shot by breathless billionaires became the most coveted currency on the internet. Financial news outlets ran stunned minute-by-minute analyses, not of the diamond's record-breaking price, but of the corporate coup it had triggered. Tabloids, for their part, had a field day plastering Stephen's enraged face and Victoria's ghost-white shock across their front pages with screaming headlines: "The billion-dollar gavel, Vanderbilt vanquished, the wife's revenge." For Stephen Vanderbilt, the days that followed were a surreal waking nightmare. He was trapped in his Geneva hotel suite, the same one where he and Victoria had toasted to their future just nights before. Now it was a prison. His phone, once a conduit of power, became an instrument of torture, buzzing incessantly with calls from his panicked board members, his horrified lawyers and reporters baying for his blood. He didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he possibly say? His emergency board meeting for Ethelred Corp was a brutal, sterile affair, conducted via video conference. The faces of the men and women who had once lauded his genius were now cold, impassive masks of disappointment. There was no debate, no discussion. The stock had plummeted 30% at the opening bell. The Chen Consortium had formally withdrawn, citing concerns over leadership stability. He was a liability of catastrophic proportions. The vote for his removal as CEO was unanimous. He watched the digital hands raise against him one by one, methodically severing him from the company he had built. Stripped of his holding company, by Mildred and his CEO title by the board, he was left adrift, a king without a kingdom. His vast fortune now locked in a legal battle he had no chance of winning. He became a ghost in his own life, a pariah in the world he once ruled. The whispers of his spectacular downfall following him into every room he dared to enter. Victoria Lacroix's erasure was swifter and more silent. She fled Geneva on a commercial flight, her crimson gown stuffed into a bag like a bloody rag. The legal notices from Stratton and Bell followed her to London, then to her parents' modest home in Lyon. They were not threats, they were simple statements of fact. The assets would be seized. Her gallery, funded with what was now deemed stolen capital, was shuttered. The artworks were repossessed. The lease on her Soho apartment was terminated. Every trapping of the life she believed she had earned was systematically dismantled, revealed to be nothing more than a temporary loan. She was not a player in the game, she realized with a sickening clarity. She was merely one of the pieces Mildred had swept from the board. She was left with nothing but the cloying scent of fleur de nuit on a coat she could no longer afford, a bitter reminder of a future that had never been hers. While their worlds imploded, Mildred's began to take shape. She did not make a triumphant return. She walked into the gleaming, monolithic headquarters of what was still called Vanderbilt Global on a quiet Monday morning. The cavernous marble lobby fell silent as she passed the security guards and employees, staring unsure of how to react to the mythical figure from the headlines. Her first meeting with the executive team was a study in quiet authority. They were Stephen's men, wary and skeptical, expecting a dramatic purge. Instead, Mildred, serene and composed in a simple navy dress that accommodated her pregnancy, spoke not of revenge, but of restoration. She laid out her vision for the company with a clarity and precision that left them speechless. She identified weaknesses in Stephen's vanity projects, and outlined new forward-thinking investments in sustainable tech areas her own charitable foundation had been pioneering for years. There were no theatrics, only competence. She wasn't a grieving wife. She was their new commander-in-chief. By the end of the day, the fear in the boardroom had been replaced by a grudging and then a growing respect. Within a week, the first major change was made. The name Vanderbilt Global was removed from the building. In its place, elegant steel letters were installed, the De Winter Vanderbilt Group. The hyphen was a bridge, but the order of the names was a declaration of the new hierarchy. The De Winter legacy was now the bedrock. Her most crucial meeting took place not in New York, but in Shanghai. She met Mr. Chen in his private tea house, a tranquil oasis of dark wood and flowing water high above the bustling city. He watched her over the rim of a delicate porcelain cup, his eyes appraising. She did not apologize for the spectacle in Geneva. She addressed it head-on. "You witnessed a necessary correction, Mr. Chen," she stated calmly. "A foundation of instability has been removed. Now we can build." She spent the next 2 hours detailing a revised partnership proposal, one that was not only more profitable, but also more ethically sound, aligning with his own well-known principles. By the time the tea was cold, Mr. Chen had extended his hand. The deal was not just salvaged, it was stronger than ever. 2 months after the auction in the quiet of a New York hospital, Mildred gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. As she held him for the first time, all the noise of the past few months, the legal battles, the stock prices, the headlines, faded into an insignificant hum. Looking into her son's tiny, perfect face, she felt the last vestiges of pain and betrayal wash away, replaced by a fierce, boundless love. This was the reason. This small, warm weight in her arms was the future she had fought for. He was the entire world. The nurse asked for the father's name for the birth certificate. Mildred paused for only a second before she answered. "There is no father to be listed," she said, her voice soft but firm. "His name is Nicholas Charles de Winter." He would carry her name. He would be the start of a new dynasty, one forged in fire and founded on a mother's unyielding strength. In the end, Mildred rarely thought of Stephen. Her victory was so absolute, her new life so full of purpose and love, that he became a mere footnote in her story. She had taken a life built on lies, and from its ashes had forged an amour for her son. The world had expected to see a scorned coif fall apart, but they had watched a queen build her throne. And as she sat in her office weeks later, the city lights twinkling below, with Nicholas sleeping peacefully in a bassinet by her desk, she knew she had not just won a battle. She had rewritten the very definition of power. And that is the story of how a quiet, pregnant wife walked into a lion's den and walked out the queen. It's a raw, unflinching look at what happens when a woman is pushed to the edge and decides not just to fight back, but to burn the entire system down and rebuild it in her own image. Mildred's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often underestimated, and that hell hath no fury. Like a woman with a plan, a purpose, and a prenuptial agreement drafted by the best lawyers money can buy. What do you think? Was her revenge justified, or was it a step too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story left you as speechless as the guests at that auction, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good story of epic revenge, and subscribe for more tales of drama, intrigue, and unbelievable real-life events. Thank you for listening.